Some places don't stay empty. They wait, the old man at the gas station said, shaking his head as Ethan Cole signed the paper for the shack. $50 and a name scribbled in fading ink. And just like that, the place became his. Though no one in town seemed to think it was worth even that. They laughed as he drove out past the tree line. A half-mile of dirt road leading to a structure that looked more like it had sunk into the earth than been built on it. Weathered boards bowed inward, the roof sagging under years of forgotten winters, windows clouded with dust that refused to let the light through. But Ethan didn't slow. His old pickup rolled to a stop and the engine ticked into silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. And for a moment, he just sat there with his hands resting on the wheel, breathing in the stillness like it was something he had been searching for. Beside him, Rex didn't move. The German Shepherd's ears stood high, eyes fixed on the shack with a focus that didn't match the calm air. "It's just a house, boy," Ethan muttered, opening the door, boots crunching over gravel as he stepped out. The cold wind carried the faint scent of pine and something older, something buried deep beneath the surface. Rex followed halfway, then stopped, paws planted firm, muscles tight. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just stood there as if listening to something Ethan couldn't hear. And that was the first thing that felt wrong. Because Rex always moved first. Always checked the perimeter. Always trusted the world before questioning it. But not this time. Ethan glanced back, watching the dog's chest rise slow and steady. "You coming?" he asked, but Rex didn't answer, didn't move, just tilted his head slightly toward the ground beneath the shack, and Ethan felt a faint pull in his gut he couldn't explain, like a memory brushing against the edge of his mind. He turned back to the door, pushing it open with a long creak that echoed too far inside. The air within was colder, heavier, dust hanging in the dim light like it had nowhere else to go. Wooden beams stretched low across the ceiling, and every step he took sent a soft groan through the floorboards. The place felt empty, but not forgotten, as if it had been waiting, not abandoned. Ethan set his bag down near the wall, fingers brushing the rough wood as he moved through the narrow space. And for a moment, everything was still again. Just the wind slipping through the cracks and the quiet rhythm of his own breathing. Until something changed, so subtle he almost missed it. A faint vibration beneath his boots, like the echo of a distant pulse. He froze, listening, counting without realizing why. 1 feet in. Nothing. He exhaled, shaking it off. "Old wood," he said under his breath. But outside, Rex suddenly stiffened, ears snapping forward as if the ground itself had whispered something only he could hear. And this time, he took one slow step toward the shack, then another, drawn not by curiosity, but by certainty, like he already knew exactly where the truth was buried. The second step Rex took was slower, deliberate, as if he was placing his weight carefully over something fragile beneath the earth. His nose low, ears angled forward, and Ethan watched him from the doorway with a growing unease that did not belong to the quiet morning. Because this was not how Rex behaved when something was wrong. This was how he behaved when something was hidden, something precise, something real. "What is it, boy?" Ethan murmured, stepping back outside, the cold air sharper now against his skin, and the moment his boots touched the ground again he felt it too. Faint but steady, a soft tremor that did not match the wind or the trees, something deeper, something patterned. Rex stopped 3 feet from the front steps, then shifted slightly to the left, placing one paw down firmly, then lifting it again and pressing harder, his claws scraping lightly against the dirt as if marking the exact point. Ethan crouched beside him, pressing his palm to the ground, and there it was again, so subtle most people would have missed it, a quiet pulse that came and went with unnatural precision. He closed his eyes without thinking, counting the seconds the way he had been trained years ago. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 27, and then it came again, a low vibration, steady and controlled, not random, never random. Ethan opened his eyes slowly, his breath leaving his chest in a thin cloud. "That is not the earth." Settling, he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. Rex let out a soft sound, not quite a bark, more like recognition, and stepped back, giving Ethan space as if he understood what needed to happen next. The ground here was different, compact, but hollow beneath the surface. Ethan reached for a loose piece of metal near the porch, using it to scrape away the top layer of dirt, each movement careful, measured. And with every inch cleared, the feeling grew stronger, the vibration clearer, until the edge of something unnatural revealed itself, a straight line where no natural line should exist. He brushed away the remaining soil with his hands, exposing weathered wood that did not belong to the shack above it. This was older, treated, reinforced, built to last. His fingers traced along the edge until they found a seam, and then a small recessed handle, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Ethan sat back slightly, staring at it as the past pressed against the present, because he had seen this before. Not here, not in this place, but in another time, another mission, structures buried to be forgotten, designed to disappear. You found it, he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the moment and everything to do with memory. Rex sat beside him now, calm, watchful, as if the tension had already passed for him. As if this was not a discovery but a confirmation, Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans, then reached for the handle, hesitating for just a second as the wind moved through the trees behind him, carrying that same faint metallic scent. And somewhere deep below, the steady pulse continued, patient, unchanging, like it had been waiting for someone to finally listen. The handle was colder than the air around it, a kind of cold that did not come from weather but from time, and Ethan felt it settle into his palm as he tightened his grip, the metal unmoving at first as if it had forgotten how to respond. Then, with a slow resistance, it shifted, releasing a faint click that echoed deeper than it should have, not loud, but precise, mechanical, deliberate, and the ground seemed to hold its breath for a moment before the seam beneath his hand separated just enough to reveal darkness below. Rex stood immediately, ears forward again, but this time he did not hesitate. He stepped closer, peering down into the narrow opening as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Ethan pushed the panel further, the wood lifting with a heavy drag until a hidden hatch revealed itself fully, reinforced edges, sealed tight for decades, and beneath it a ladder descended into shadow. The air rising from below carried that same metallic scent, stronger now, mixed with something dry and preserved, untouched by time. Ethan sat back on his heels, looking into the darkness as the faint pulse continued somewhere below, steady as before, unchanged, and it sent a quiet tension through his chest because he knew that rhythm did not belong to something broken. It belonged to something that still worked, something that had not stopped, that should not still be running. He said under his breath, and Rex let out a soft exhale, almost like agreement. The dog's tail low but not afraid, just alert, focused. Ethan reached into his pack and pulled out a small flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path into the space below, revealing metal walls, clean lines, no collapse, no decay. This was not a forgotten hole in the ground. This was a structure built with intention, preserved by design. He angled the light further, counting the rungs of the ladder, 12, maybe 13 feet down, not deep enough to be a bunker for survival, but deep enough to hide something important, something meant to be found only by those who knew where to look. His jaw tightened slightly as a memory surfaced. A briefing room, a map, coordinates marked and then erased, places that were never supposed to be revisited, places that held things the world chose to forget. Ethan exhaled slowly, steadying himself, then looked at Rex. "You coming with me?" he asked quietly, and the dog stepped forward without hesitation this time, placing one paw on the edge of the hatch. Ready, Ethan swung his legs over and found the first rung with his boot, testing the weight, solid, unmoving, every piece of it still intact after all these years. He descended carefully, one step at a time, the light shifting with each movement, shadows pulling back just enough to reveal more of the truth waiting below, and as his boots finally touched the metal floor, the sound echoed softly through the space, not hollow, but contained, controlled, the kind of sound that belonged to something sealed away from the world. Rex followed close behind, landing quietly beside him, and together they stood in a place that had not been seen in decades, the air still, the walls lined with panels and markings faded but recognizable, and directly ahead, set into the far side of the room, was a heavy steel door, closed, untouched, and humming faintly with that same steady pulse, as if whatever lay beyond it had never stopped waiting. The hum behind the steel door was not loud, but it filled the room in a way that made silence feel impossible, a steady vibration that seemed to settle into the bones rather than the ears, and Ethan stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light, the beam of his flashlight gliding across the walls where faded markings and old stenciled numbers clung to the metal like echoes of another time. This place had not been abandoned in the way. People understood abandonment. It had been sealed, preserved, left with intention. Rex moved ahead slowly, his steps measured, nose tracing the edges of the room until he stopped just a few feet from the door, sitting down with a calm certainty that told Ethan everything he needed to know. Whatever mattered was on the other side of that steel. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air cool and dry against his throat, then stepped forward, each footstep soft but deliberate, the kind of movement that came from years of training his body to respect unknown spaces. The door itself was thick, reinforced, built to outlast time, and at its center was a control panel, simple, mechanical, no modern electronics. Just switches and a recessed dial coated in a thin layer of dust that had not been disturbed in decades. Ethan brushed it away with his fingers, revealing engraved instructions worn but still readable. And something about the design pulled at his memory again. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to make his pulse slow, focused. He had seen systems like this before, designed for reliability, for longevity, for the kind of secrets that were never meant to depend on fragile things. Rex shifted slightly, his ears flicking as the hum beneath the door changed just enough to be noticed, still steady, but closer now, as if whatever powered it had sensed movement. Ethan placed his hand on the dial, feeling the weight of it, the resistance built into its design, and for a brief second he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because once something like this was opened, it could not be undone. The past did not stay buried once invited back. The wind above whispered faintly through the hatch, distant and separate from this place. A reminder that the world outside still existed, still simple, still unaware, but down here time had been held in place, waiting for a single decision. Ethan turned the dial slowly, each notch clicking into place with a deep, grounded sound that echoed through the metal walls. One, then another, then a third, and as the final position settled, the hum shifted, growing slightly stronger before releasing into a low mechanical sigh, like something long dormant stretching awake. The locks inside the door disengaged one by one, not rushed, not chaotic, but precise, controlled, and the seam along the edges of the steel door widened just enough to reveal a thin line of darkness beyond. Rex stood immediately, tail low but steady, his gaze fixed on that opening, and Ethan placed his hand against the cold surface, pushing gently as the door moved inward with a weight that spoke of everything it had protected. And as the gap widened, the beam of his flashlight slipped through, revealing shapes within, edges of crates, metal cases stacked with order, untouched, and the air that drifted out carried not decay, but preservation, like the breath of something that had been waiting not to survive, but to be found. The beam of Ethan's flashlight moved slowly across the interior as the door opened wider, revealing a room that felt untouched by time, not in decay, but in preservation, every surface dry, every edge sharp, as if the years above had never reached this place. Rows of metal crates lined the walls with a precision that spoke of discipline, each one marked with faded military codes and dates that traced back decades. Rex stepped forward first, his movements quiet, controlled, his nose lifting slightly as he took in the air, not searching anymore, but confirming. Ethan followed, boots echoing softly against the metal floor, the sound contained, absorbed by the walls, and as he moved deeper into the room the steady hum he had felt before seemed to settle into the background, no longer a warning, but a presence, something constant, something alive in its own mechanical way. He crouched beside the nearest crate, running his fingers along the surface, the paint chipped but intact, the latch sealed but not locked, and when he lifted it the hinge moved without resistance, smooth, maintained, as if someone had expected it to be opened again one day. Inside the crate the contents were wrapped carefully in oilcloth, layers of protection against time and moisture. Ethan peeled it back slowly, revealing a row of neatly stacked bars, dull gold in the low light, their surfaces stamped with insignias worn but unmistakable. He did not react immediately, did not reach out, just looked, his expression steady, Absorbing the reality of what sat in front of him, Rex remained close, sitting beside him now, calm, watchful. As if this moment was not about excitement, but about understanding, Ethan exhaled. Slowly, the sound barely audible, and closed the crate again, not out of disbelief, but out of respect for the weight of it, because this was never just about value. He stood and turned, sweeping the light across the rest of the room. More crates, more cases, some smaller, some larger, each one placed with intention, and against the far wall a narrow metal desk stood with a single object resting on top, a worn leather journal. Its edges cracked with age, but its presence unmistakably deliberate. Ethan approached it carefully, the air around it somehow heavier, as if this was the true center of the room, not the gold, not the crates, but the story behind them. He reached out and lifted the journal, the leather soft but fragile under his fingers, and when he opened it the pages revealed neat, steady handwriting, entries dated from a time long past, each line written with purpose, not rushed, not careless, but measured, like someone documenting something that mattered beyond their own lifetime. Ethan's eyes moved across the words, his breathing slowing as the meaning began to take shape. This was not a forgotten stash, not something lost by accident. This had been placed here, hidden with intention, waiting, and as the faint hum continued behind the walls and Rex rested quietly at his side, Ethan understood something that no one in that town could have guessed. The shack above had never been worthless. It had been a door, and it had only ever been meant to open for someone who knew how to listen. The pages of the journal carried a quiet weight, the kind that did not come from paper but from intention, and Ethan turned them slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile edges. Each line written in steady script that had not rushed even when time must have felt uncertain. Dates marked across the top told a story that stretched back over 70 years, entries describing movement, decisions, and finally a choice, a deliberate act of concealment, not out of fear, but out of purpose. The writer spoke of a fortune gathered during a time when the world was uncertain, resources meant to rebuild, to restore, but circumstances had shifted, trust had become fragile, and so the decision was made to hide it, to protect it from being lost to the wrong hands. Ethan's eyes moved across a particular line, one written darker than the rest, as if pressed with more force. This will remain until it finds someone who understands its weight, he read softly, the words settling into the room as the faint hum continued around him. Rex lifted his head slightly at the sound of Ethan's voice, then relaxed again, as if the meaning behind the words carried more significance than the sound itself. Ethan closed the journal halfway, his thumb resting between the pages, and looked around the room again, seeing it differently now, not as a hidden vault, not as a forgotten space, but as something intentional, something preserved not just for safekeeping, but for discovery. He stepped toward another crate, opening it with the same careful movement. Inside were documents, maps folded with precision, coordinates marked and labeled in a way that reflected a mind trained to think ahead, to plan beyond the present moment. He unfolded one slowly, the paper stiff but intact, revealing a network of locations, supply routes, notes written in the margins, not random, not chaotic, but part of something larger, something that had never been completed. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in tension, but in recognition, because he understood now that this place had not been the end of a plan. It had been a pause, a point where everything had been set aside with the hope that someone else might one day continue it. Rex stood and moved closer, his presence steady, grounding. As Ethan placed the map back into the crate, the hum around them shifted almost imperceptibly, softer now, less insistent, as if whatever had been waiting beneath the surface had begun to settle. Ethan picked up the journal again, flipping to the final pages, the handwriting there slightly less steady but still clear, and at the bottom of the last entry, a simple line. If you are reading this, then time has chosen you. Do not take this as wealth. Take it as responsibility. Ethan closed the journal fully this time, holding it in both hands as the meaning settled into him. Not overwhelming, not heavy in the way people might expect, but clear, grounded, like a truth that had been waiting quietly for the right moment to be understood. Rex leaned gently against his leg, the warmth of the dog a contrast to the cool air of the room, and Ethan exhaled slowly, looking once more at the crates, the maps, the silent order of everything around him, knowing now that what had been hidden here was never just meant to be found. It was meant to be carried forward by someone who would not be changed by it. But guided by it, the silence in the room felt different now, no longer waiting, no longer tense, but settled, as if the space itself had recognized something had changed, and Ethan stood there for a long moment with the journal still in his hands, the weight of it not physical but certain, like a quiet instruction that did not need to be repeated. Rex shifted beside him, his breathing steady, his presence grounding, and when Ethan finally moved, it was not with urgency, but with intention. He placed the journal carefully back on the metal desk, not closing the story but acknowledging it, then turned his attention once more to the crates, this time not as discoveries, but as pieces of something larger, something unfinished. He opened another case, smaller than the others, its contents arranged with the same precision. Inside were envelopes, each labeled with names and locations, towns scattered across states, places that felt familiar in the way rural places often do, quiet, overlooked, carrying more history than anyone ever spoke about. Ethan lifted one envelope, running his thumb across the name written on the front. The ink faded but legible, and for a moment he simply held it, understanding forming not as a sudden realization, but as something that had been building since the moment Rex first stopped outside the shack. This was never meant to stay buried forever. It had been divided, prepared, meant to move outward again, not all at once, not for attention, but for purpose. Rex rose and stepped closer, his nose brushing lightly against Ethan's hand, as if reminding him of something simple, something steady. Ethan gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then placed the envelope back where it belonged, closing the case gently. The hum in the walls had softened even further now, almost fading into the background completely, as if whatever mechanism had been maintaining this place was beginning to rest, its purpose fulfilled. Ethan walked slowly through the room one last time, his eyes tracing the order, the care, the quiet discipline that had preserved everything here, and when he reached the ladder, again he paused, looking back into the space not with awe, not with disbelief, but with a calm understanding. This was not something that would change who he was, it was something that would ask something of him. And that was a different kind of weight entirely. Rex moved ahead of him, placing his paws on the first rung and climbing up without hesitation. As if the path forward was already clear, Ethan followed, the metal ladder cool beneath his hands, each step bringing him back toward the surface, toward the wind and the light and the world that had no idea what rested beneath that quiet patch of ground. When he stepped out into the open air again, the sky had shifted, clouds moving slowly across a pale blue stretch, the trees swaying gently. Nothing dramatic, nothing changed on the surface, and yet everything felt different. Rex stepped out beside him, shaking the dust from his coat before settling at Ethan's side. Calm, certain, Ethan reached back and closed the hatch, lowering it carefully until it sealed once more, the seam disappearing beneath the earth as if it had never been there. And for a moment he stood there, looking at the spot where everything had been hidden, not with possession, not with excitement, but with a quiet sense of responsibility, because some discoveries were not meant to be kept, they were meant to be understood, and then carried forward in ways no one else would ever see. The rest of the day passed without urgency, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty but settled, and Ethan moved through it with the same steady rhythm he had carried for years, repairing loose boards on the shack, reinforcing the door, clearing away the overgrowth that had crept too close to the walls, each action simple, grounded, as if returning the place above to something livable mattered just as much as what lay beneath it. Rex stayed close, but not restless, his movements calm, his attention no longer fixed on the ground, as if whatever had called to him before had been answered. And when the sun began to lower behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the clearing, Ethan paused, leaning lightly against the porch post, looking out over the stretch of land that now felt different in a way he could not fully explain. Not because it had changed, but because he had. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and distant earth, familiar, steady, and for the first time since arriving, the place did not feel like something to figure out. It felt like something to care for. Rex lay down near the steps, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but aware, always aware, and Ethan glanced down at him. A faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close to it. "You knew," he said quietly, and Rex's ear flicked slightly, acknowledging. Without needing to respond, as the sky dimmed into evening, Ethan stepped inside, lighting a small lantern that cast a warm glow across the worn interior, the shadows softer now, less uncertain, and he set his pack down near the wall, pulling out the journal once more, placing it carefully on the small table he had cleared earlier, the leather catching the light in a way that made it feel almost alive, not in motion, but in presence. He sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath his weight, and opened it again, this time not searching, not scanning, but reading with intention, line by line, letting the words settle, understanding not just what had been written, but why it had been written. The entries spoke of responsibility, of patience, of choosing the right moment over the easy one, and as he read, the sounds of the night began to build around him, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of something unseen, the quiet rhythm of the world continuing as it always had, unaware of the story unfolding in that small, forgotten place. Hours passed without him noticing, the lantern burning low as the final pages of the journal revealed not instructions, but reflections, the kind that could only come from someone who had already made their choice and accepted its cost. Ethan closed the journal gently, resting his hand on its cover for a moment, the weight of it no longer unfamiliar, but steady, like something that belonged in his life now, not as a burden, but as a direction. Rex shifted slightly, lifting his head as if sensing the change in him, then settled again, calm, certain, and Ethan leaned back in the chair, looking toward the door where the night stretched out beyond the threshold, quiet and endless. And he understood then that what he had found was not meant to pull him away from the world, but to guide how he moved through it, one step at a time, in ways no one else would ever need to see. Morning arrived quietly, the kind of soft light that does not demand attention, but slowly reveals what has always been there. And Ethan woke before the sun fully cleared the horizon, not from habit alone, but from a sense of purpose that had settled into him during the night. Rex was already awake, sitting near the door with his gaze fixed outward, calm and steady, as if waiting for something that did not need to be rushed. Ethan rose and stepped outside, the air cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine. The shack behind him no longer felt like something temporary. It felt anchored, part of the land in a way that made sense now. He stood for a moment looking out across the clearing, the trees stretching in quiet rows, the world unchanged. And yet there was a subtle difference in how he saw it, not as a place to pass through, but as a place connected to something larger than itself. Rex moved ahead a few steps, then stopped and looked back, not alert, not warning, just aware, and Ethan followed, his boots pressing into the soft ground as they walked toward the edge of the property, the same place where Rex had first paused, first listened. Now there was no tension there, only stillness, the kind that comes after something has been understood. Ethan crouched slightly, brushing his hand across the earth where the hidden hatch lay beneath, the surface undisturbed, the secret intact, but no longer unknown. He did not open it, did not feel the need to, because what mattered was not beneath his feet anymore, it was what came next. Rex lowered himself beside him, resting comfortably, and Ethan glanced at him with a quiet nod. "We do this right," he said softly, the words simple, but certain, the kind that did not need to be spoken twice. The morning light grew stronger, filtering through the trees and casting long beams across the clearing, and with it came a sense of movement, not physical, but internal, a direction forming without urgency. Ethan stood and turned back toward the shack, his steps steady, each one grounded in the same calm resolve that had carried him through far more uncertain paths before. Inside, the journal rested where he had left it, and he picked it up again, not as something fragile, but as something active, a guide rather than a relic, flipping through the pages until he found the names again, the towns, the places that had been marked with intention. He studied them carefully, committing them to memory, not rushing, not skipping, understanding that each one carried its own story, its own purpose. Rex lay near the doorway, watching, not impatient, just present, and when Ethan closed the journal once more, the decision had already been made. not in a single moment, but through everything that had led to this one. He set the journal into his pack, not hidden, not buried, but carried, then stepped back outside, the world waiting in its usual quiet way, unchanged for everyone else, but for him. It had shifted just enough to matter, and as he walked toward the truck with Rex at his side, there was no sense of leaving something behind. Only the understanding that what had been found was now meant to move forward, step by step, in ways that would never draw attention, but would quietly shape the path ahead. The road stretched long and quiet as Ethan drove out of the tree line, the tires of the old pickup humming softly against the worn asphalt. And for the first time in a long while, the sound did not feel like escape. It felt like direction. Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, eyes forward, alert but calm, as if he understood that this journey was different from the ones before, not wandering, not searching, but moving with purpose. The small town came into view slowly, the same buildings, the same faded signs. Nothing about it had changed since the day before, and yet as Ethan pulled into the gas station, the place where the old man had warned him, there was a subtle shift in how it all felt. Less like a place that judged, more like a place that simply existed, waiting to be understood. The bell above the door gave a soft chime as he stepped inside, the scent of oil and coffee lingering in the air, and the old man looked up from behind the counter, his eyes narrowing slightly in recognition. "You went through with it," he said, not unkindly, just certain. Ethan gave a small nod, his expression steady. "I did," he replied, his voice calm, and for a moment the old man studied him, as if searching for something, perhaps regret, perhaps frustration, but finding neither, he leaned back slightly, folding his arms. "And was it worth it?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying more weight than it seemed. Ethan paused, not because he did not have an answer, but because the answer was not something that fit into a single word. He glanced briefly at Rex, who stood quietly at his side, then back at the old man. "It was not what I expected," he said finally, and something in his tone caused the old man's expression to shift, not confusion, but curiosity, a quiet understanding that some things did not need to be explained to be recognized. Ethan reached into his pocket and placed a small folded bill on the counter, not large, not noticeable, just enough. The old man looked down at it, then back up, his brow tightening slightly. "You fixing the place up?" he asked, and Ethan nodded again. "It is a good place," he said simply. The old man let out a soft breath, something between a chuckle and a sigh. "No one ever said that before," he replied, shaking his head lightly. And for a moment the two men stood there in a silence that was not uncomfortable, just present, like the pause between understanding and acceptance. Outside, the wind moved gently across the lot, carrying with it the same steady rhythm of the day, unchanged, unremarkable, and yet as Ethan turned to leave, Rex stepping beside him without hesitation, there was a quiet certainty in his movement, not something that needed to be seen or acknowledged, but something that would shape what came next, because some discoveries were not meant to be explained, they were meant to be lived, one quiet choice at a time. The next town was nearly 40 miles away, a small place tucked between rolling fields and a narrow river that reflected the sky like glass, and Ethan drove in just after midday, the sunlight high and clear, casting everything in a quiet, honest light. Rex sat steady beside him, his gaze shifting now and then as if tracking something unseen, not out of concern, but awareness, always awareness. Ethan slowed as he passed a row of aging storefronts, his eyes scanning until he found the address written in the journal, a modest building with a faded sign and a porch that leaned slightly with time. Nothing remarkable at first glance, but there was something about it, something familiar in the way places hold on to stories without speaking them. He parked along the curb and stepped out, the air warmer here, carrying the scent of grass and distant water, and for a moment he simply stood there, letting the place settle around him. Rex moved ahead a few steps, then stopped, turning back briefly before continuing toward the porch, his movements calm, certain, as if guiding rather than following. Ethan walked up the worn wooden steps, each one creaking softly under his weight, and knocked gently on the door, not rushed, not demanding, just present. The sound echoed lightly inside before fading into stillness. A moment passed, then another, and just as he began to wonder if anyone was home, the door opened slowly, revealing an older woman, her hair silver and tied loosely at the back, her eyes sharp but kind, studying him with quiet curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady, and Ethan nodded slightly, not stepping forward yet, not imposing. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, reaching into his jacket and carefully removing the envelope he had taken earlier, holding it out with both hands. The woman's gaze shifted to it, her expression tightening just slightly, as if recognizing something she had not expected to see again. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing the edge as though testing whether it was real, and when she opened it, the air between them seemed to change, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. Her eyes moved across the contents, her breathing slowing as something deeper than surprise settled in, something closer to memory, to understanding. She looked back up at Ethan, searching his face for an explanation, but finding only calm. "Where did you get this?" she asked softly, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "It was waiting," he replied, his tone simple, not evasive, just honest. The woman held the envelope closer, her hands trembling slightly now, not from weakness, but from the weight of what it represented. Rex sat quietly beside Ethan, his presence steady, his eyes calm, as if he had already accepted this moment long before it arrived. The woman stepped back slowly, opening the door wider without speaking, an invitation not just to enter, but to acknowledge something long set aside, and Ethan stepped forward, not as someone bringing answers, but as someone continuing a story that had been waiting patiently to move again. The house carried a warmth that did not come from heat alone, but from years lived quietly within its walls, and as Ethan stepped inside, the wooden floor creaked softly beneath his boots, the sound familiar, grounding. The woman moved slowly toward a small table near the window, her hands still holding the envelope, as if letting go of it too quickly might break whatever moment had found its way back to her. She sat down carefully, her eyes returning to the contents again, reading not just the words but the memory behind them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rex settled near the doorway, his body relaxed but attentive, his presence filling the space with a calm that required no explanation. The woman finally looked up, her expression no longer uncertain, but softened by something deeper, something that had been waiting far longer than Ethan had known. "My father used to speak about something like this," she said quietly, her voice steady but distant, as if reaching back through years she had learned to leave untouched. "He said there were things left behind, not because they were forgotten, but because they were meant to be found later, when the world was ready to use them the right way." She paused, her gaze drifting briefly toward the window where the afternoon light filtered in, gentle and unchanged, then back to Ethan. "I thought it was just a story," she added, almost to herself. Ethan listened without interrupting, his posture calm, his presence steady, not there to explain, not there to lead, just there to continue what had already begun. The woman placed the envelope down on the table with care, her fingers lingering on it for a moment before she withdrew her hand. "There are others," she said after a while, her voice clearer now, more certain. "Other names, other places. He mentioned them once, not all at once, but enough for me to remember that this was never meant for just one person." Ethan gave a slight nod, acknowledging what he already understood, that this was only one part of something larger, something that extended beyond any single place or moment. The room remained quiet, but not empty, filled instead with a sense of continuation, as if the story that had been paused so many years ago had quietly begun moving again. The woman stood slowly, walking to a nearby shelf where old photographs rested in simple frames. She picked one up and looked at it for a long moment. Before turning it toward Ethan, a younger man stood beside her in the image, his posture strong, his expression calm, carrying the same quiet certainty that Ethan had come to recognize. "He believed in doing things that no one would ever see," she said softly. "Not because they would be remembered, but because they mattered." Ethan studied the photograph briefly, then looked back at her, understanding not just the words, but the intention behind them. Rex shifted slightly, his tail brushing softly against the floor, the only movement in a moment that felt suspended between past and present. And as the light continued to drift across the room, There was no urgency, no pressure to act, only the quiet understanding that what had been set in motion would continue, one step at a time, carried not by force, but by those willing to listen and move forward with care. The afternoon light softened as Ethan stepped back onto the porch, the door closing gently behind him with a quiet finality that did not feel like an ending, but a continuation. The woman remained inside, holding on to something that had found its way back to her after years of silence. And as Ethan descended the worn wooden steps, Rex falling into place beside him without command, there was a calm understanding in the way both of them moved. Not hurried, not uncertain, just steady. The truck waited where he had left it, unchanged, like everything else on the surface of the world. And yet as he opened the door and glanced once more at the house behind him, there was a subtle shift in the way it stood, not different in structure, but in meaning, as if something long carried had finally been shared. Ethan started the engine, the familiar rumble filling the quiet street, and pulled away slowly, the town receding behind him in the same unremarkable way it had appeared, no one watching, no one aware. And that was exactly how it was meant to be. The road stretched ahead once more, winding through fields and trees that carried their own silent histories, and Rex settled into the seat, his body relaxed, his gaze no longer searching, as if the path forward had already been accepted. Miles passed beneath the tires without urgency, each one a quiet step in something larger than distance. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, Ethan felt no need to look back, because nothing had been left unfinished, only continued. When he finally reached the edge of the forest where the shack stood waiting, the air greeted him with the same familiar stillness, but it no longer held questions, only presence. He parked and stepped out, the ground firm beneath his boots, the trees whispering softly in the evening breeze. Rex moved ahead, pausing briefly at the spot where the hidden hatch lay, beneath the earth, not out of tension, but acknowledgement, then continued on toward the porch. Ethan followed, his movements quiet, grounded, and when he stepped inside, the lantern light flickered gently against the walls, casting a warm glow that felt less like shelter and more like belonging. He set his pack down, the journal resting within it, not hidden, not displayed, simply carried. And for a moment he stood there, listening to the quiet rhythm of the place, the wind, the wood, the distant sounds of a world that did not need to know what had changed, because some things were never meant to be seen, only lived. Rex lay down near the door, his breathing slow, steady, and Ethan sat down across from him, the weight of the day settling not as burden, but as clarity. And in that stillness, there was no need for conclusion, no need for recognition. Only the quiet truth that what had been found was not the fortune beneath the ground, but the purpose above it. And sometimes, that was the only kind of wealth that ever truly lasted.